We have a fun meta in Overwatch 2. In fact, I like to call it the three outs meta. And the reason I call it that is there are three main defensive outs that you need to think about. We're going to use this fight as an example. I'll let it play through and then I'll go through some of the concepts in detail here. But what you're looking at is three main defensive outs that you need to be tracking to understand the tempo of the fight, at least in the neutral. And that's going to be both Zarya bubbles and then Protection Suzu. Those cooldowns are all basically immortality. And you can say, oh, a bubble isn't immortality, it can be burst through. By the time you burst it through, Protection Suzu would have worn off too. I don't care. Those are effectively defensive outs that you're probably not going to be able to eliminate people as most heroes in Overwatch, until they're gone or the people using them makes a mistake, is too slow, etc. The exception to this is sort of the meta shaper right now, the meta breaker if you want to call them that, which is going to be Sojourn. Sojourn can charge up railguns, and then a railgun headshot on a squishy will delete people, and because these defensive outs are reactive, they have to see an incoming threat, like a dive coming in, or starting to take damage, that sort of thing. There's going to be no protection against a one-shot that can happen from halfway across the map that doesn't have a dive obvious wind-up. You can't bubble someone just because railgun's available, because they can hold railgun longer than that. So we've got that. That sort of makes sense to us. No big deal. Let's start talking through how this really works here. And what we're going to see is going into this team fight, we see some couple pretty cool things. So this is, again, our meta compositions. We're looking at these. This is very standard. You could run a BAP instead of a Kiriko. No problem. You switch out one of your defensive outs, Suzu, for Lamp. Same thing, effectively, both immortality. You could, if you wanted, swap in a Sombra or a Tracer, maybe even an Echo in the Genji slot. Doesn't really matter. But what we're really looking at here is these are effectively the basic version of the composition. So we talked about you're trying to trade resources. Now, it's not unusual when you're running a brawlier or divier comp to go, hey, or even a poke comp to go, hey, we want to get a resource advantage before we force the brawl phase, before we force the serious engage. Okay, that can make sense in a lot of matchups. Fine. So these are three of the major things that you track. But obviously, if you find you have a massive health advantage or a massive positioning advantage, or you have a pick, or you just got the ultimate you want, you might use those as well and say, okay, we're willing to push even with those out there. But sort of a main framework to think of is these three big defensive abilities where you want two or three of them gone before you hard commit to the fight, before you start committing serious expensive offensive resources and start walking in such a way that you wouldn't expect to be able to get out, that sort of thing. So what should you do while you're jockeying for position as you start to approach each other? Well, what both of these teams start with is going to be Sojourn's E. And that's perfectly fine. We see Sojourn Z comes out there. That's perfectly fine. We're using this. We're trying to apply some poke, trying to build some railgun, and most importantly, we're trying to force out these defensive abilities. And we're going to see this Zarya bubble come out. Is this like a bad thing that Shikigami used their Zarya bubble? Not at all. You have to use Zarya bubbles to start gaining energy. That's just how Zarya works. So even though you want to have your defensive outs, you have to start cycling through hers to get energy. Fine. You want to get it. This is fine. We see that this Zarya is also going to take a Zarya right click as well as the Sojourn. They'll get reasonable enough energy out of this. This is not some mistake on their part. We're also seeing the Sojourns are starting to take angles. They're not getting too aggressive yet. They're not like up on this platform on hard off angles yet, but they're starting to take angles. And we like that because they want to start to take angles, start charging those railguns. And as these tanks, as these front lines sort of meet, they want to crank open those angles and really have those easy railgun shots that can just win the fight by skipping through all of the outs there. That's what we want to see. This is pretty good so far. Then we see the first thing I don't like, which is Altoria's Genji dives in with a bubble. Genji getting a bubble when he dives in is perfectly fine. He basically needs it because otherwise he just gets melted by Zarya. Deflect does no good against that. And if he dives in, the truth is Deflect wouldn't last long enough even if the Zarya doesn't pay attention to him for him to live in this situation. So he needs the bubble so he can take the bubble, get some energy for Zarya, and then have the Deflect. Our Zarya's higher energy. Maybe he'll be able to last here. But the problem that you run into is it's still a long time for Genji to last if there's not some easy out like like dropping to low ground, wrapping around a corner that's actually cover, and there isn't one of these here. And it also takes away your offensive burst once this team is low on resources. So if you're trying to go into Shikigami and you go, hey, they're out both bubbles and they're out protection Suzu. What I really want to be able to do right now is dash, because that's going to be a single powerful ability. And if we can get Genji going, he'll clean everything else up. But we really need to be able to take advantage of that window, and if we've used our dash early, but not so early that we'll get it back, not while we're actually still very separated, teams apart, like you might see at the beginning of Parseo, you might see the Genji dash up there knowing, hey, they're not going to drop in and come fight us, I can just drop because they want to keep their high ground unless they get massively ahead, and we aren't going to do the fight until I've got a little energy for my Zarya. That might be fine. This isn't as good in my opinion. But we've seen one bubble used from both Zaryas, we've seen E's come out from Sojourn. We see the Sojourn starting to take off angles. This Sojourn is going to start to get forced back by the Genji diving in, and that does have some value, but again, it's a little bit early for our Genji to be doing that because the Sojourn is too close to the team. Genji is potentially punishable here. So we start to see this, and then we see Protection Suzu. Protection Suzu is a big deal because now Shikigami is down both one Zarya bubble and one Protection Suzu. They only have one bubble left. This should be a green light, a big blinking green light for Altaria to push, that they want to go in here. Lucio, swap over to speed, team walk in, Sojourn, crank open your off angle. This is what we wanted. Now, it would be really nice if we had dash to go in with here, but that did already get used. So this is going to happen. Then we see the second bubble used by Altaria here. So now we're more balanced on defensive resources, but I do put Altaria in the better position, both because they were able to take more positioning here, they were able to take more space, and now that they've sort of collapsed for their dive, the Protection Suzu is the more valuable defensive cooldown than the one remaining bubble that Shikigami has, simply because it is AoE, and the AoE is going to be valuable as these teams have sort of collapsed for the dive here. So this is good. We like this. Shikigami did a pretty good job with the retreat. They put their tank alone over here. They pulled their core over here. If you try to push their tank, who does still have a bubble left, you're going to get shot in the back. But I also like what happened right over here from Altaria, where their Sojourn has taken this deeper off angle. Now we should be looking at Altaria to realize, our offensive team to realize, that they don't actually have a cooldown advantage anymore. Remember, they evened it up at 2 major defensive cooldowns used each, and because Shikigami used theirs first, they'll be back first. That created the opportunity for an offensive window, and Altaria got a lot of space out of that offensive window. But now they need to recognize that Altaria's counter-offensive window will come back up before they will have all of their resources back. Not long before, but a little bit before, which means they need to set up their own defensive concave and sort of accept that they effectively got huge amounts of map control off of what they did initially here, so they just need to not surrender as much. And this should lead to a fight win for them. It looks like Altaria is setting up to do just that. They've got this here, but unfortunately, it does look like as their Zarya was backing up into position to hold, she got caught by a right click because she was holding back. She got knocked off the edge, and that is going to allow Shikigami to just sort of snowball this. But I actually mostly liked what I saw here in terms of respecting the major cooldowns that came from each team here. Didn't really like the Genji dash. I told you about that, but that's sort of what you're looking at. So if you want to know what should each role be doing in this, let's just go ahead and give ourselves that nice overhead view one more time. We can kind of see the important things to think about are, hey, we want to be tracking at a macro level if we're trying to understand our push timing, if we're trying to understand pressure, these big things. That's probably going to be most important for at a team level. Maybe your Zarya or Lucio are tracking that, and they're calling when your team is pushing, when your team is going for openings. At an individual level, this will be most important for your Genji player. What should your Genji player be doing before then? Well, they should be trying to take a little bit of an off angle to go ahead and spam in shurikens to try to force out some of those bigger defensive cooldowns. That's what we want to do. They also want to be doing some level of controlling the opposing Sojourn, because controlling the opposing Sojourn She is, of course, the one who can actually get eliminations before those cooldowns have been forced. What does your Sojourn want to do? Since we're talking about Sojourn, she also wants to go ahead and take an off angle. She'll split her off angle more. She'll make her off angle bigger as the teams actually start to meet, but she'll even start, like she did here, with a little bit of one. She wants to charge up railguns and then railgun squishies. That's really what we're looking to do there. Zarya's got to get some energy. You don't want to use both bubbles immediately right together unless you have enough space between the teams that you can't really be punished for that. You're really mostly just looking to go, hey, let me go ahead and use personable bubble to absorb some stuff, or use a bubble on a friend as an out to get them out of trouble, like, my Sojourn getting dived on, that sort of thing. No big deal there. You're just trying to put some pressure on the squishies, force out some of those defensive cooldowns early from the other team, and then swap past the bubbles. You don't need to shoot at the other Zarya's bubble. You really aren't interested in breaking bubbles in this matchup until you're in that situation where you're hard pushing them and they had no outs, but their first bubble came back online and you're already pushing them, sort of thing. Then, by all means, go ahead and break through the bubble on the target that you're focusing. So that's one thing that we'd look at. And then we move on to our supports. And our supports probably have the most complicated role here because they sort of end up switching what they're doing. They're very flexible. You're generally going to want Lucio with your Zarya because that's where Lucio will do the most good to start positioning your Zarya, getting them to where they want to be. But you also need Kiriko's healing for Zarya because if Kiriko isn't healing Zarya, Zarya is not going to have enough sustain. Kiriko is your bigger source of single target healing to a much greater degree than Lucio. But if you do that, your DPS can't do anything, and we already said Kiriko is this really important piece of your meta, plus you're in this situation where your DPS are already more frail than tanks. So if you have your tank holding one angle and someone needs to hold another angle, they can't be expected to do it alone. How do you solve that? Do you just double up on DPS on the off angle? Well, you could do that, but what actually ends up working pretty well is you're going to generally start in a situation where you go, Zarya is trying to push up, play for space a little bit. Lucio is supporting that. Then we have a DPS over here. Maybe it's going to be Sojourn that's pushing up to here. And we're actually going to have Kiriko also trying to play at that off angle where they can hit those cute little headshots. Kunai, that's going to work pretty well. They can support their off-angling DPS, but then as things progress a little bit, you may end up in a situation where Lucio, obviously Kiriko can still heal Zarya across from here, but Lucio may end up swapping to support the off-angling DPS, or maybe even choose to dive in with the Genji, while your Kiriko adjusts to more directly heal the Zarya to sustain that as we get past the poke phase, where incoming damage on your tank is a little bit lighter, and into the more brawl phase where they need to be able to pocket your tank a little bit harder. It's complicated. It's not a hard, fast start here, then swap roll. Supporting with these two is very flexible, very hard. Just recognize that they can both give support to DPS or the tank, and notice if you're in a situation where you're both pocketing your tank for too long, your DPS do need support and able to sustain on their off angles. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. This may not be the meta in the near future because we may have a Halloween patch coming up here that may have nerfs, buffs, really nerfs that we're looking at on it for some of these key heroes. But we'll go ahead and see if that's true. It was confirmed, then denied, then reconfirmed, then who knows where it is right now. But it is a lot of fun, and we'll see where things go from here. If you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. If you're enjoying the content, drop a like, consider subscribing for more thought-provoking Overwatch 2 content, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Temporal out.